Good afternoon, good morning. Just giving us a few seconds to make sure that everyone is logged in. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Megan Bailey. I'm the head of health and social protection at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. We've got a fantastic group of panelists for us today. We're going to be discussing a very timely and important subject, which is the role of social protection in alleviating the adverse impacts of climate change mitigation policies, the pursuit of achieving a just transition. We know very well that climate change mitigation efforts will be an essential component of reaching climate targets, and also that those policies may entail intended and unintended economic consequences, for which social protection has a role. This webinar will share findings from a recent study, which is entitled Pathways for Social Protection in the Just Transition of Low and Middle Income Countries. The report draws on recent literature to explore the impacts of 3 major climate change mitigation approaches on poverty, and it summarizes how social protection can be used to mitigate these negative impacts and promote the acceptability of climate change mitigation interventions, contributing to the realization of a just transition. So it's no small task we're trying to achieve in this session today. I'm going to go over some housekeeping rules, which everyone is probably very well aware of. We are recording this session, which is fantastic, so others in other time zones will be able to listen. There will be auto-generated captions that will appear on the sidebar. To give a sense of the session, there's going to be an introduction, which I'm doing now, and I'll introduce the speakers. We'll have our first presentation by Dr. Jana McCord, followed by the 3 subsequent shorter presentations and a discussion. We'll have sufficient time for a Q&A. I'm going to be clear on the timekeeping because I know that people will have a lot of questions, and I want to make sure we give an opportunity. Those will be done through the Q&A box of Zoom feature. And we'll be able to, I believe we'll be able to prioritize the questions that way, but do feel free to put the questions in throughout the presentations. You don't need to wait until the Q&A session. If there's something, we will address it in the Q&A session, but rather than forget it, do put the questions in as you can. I'd like to invite everybody to introduce themselves in the chat box. So quickly you can just say your name, what organizations you're from, and you can indicate your location. That way we just have a general sense of who's in the room. And of course, we will have your name associated with the questions in the Q&A box. If you are on social media, of course, you can interact with us with all the normal profiles, social media profiles. I think we can move on to the next slide. Great. So we've got 4 panelists with us today. First up, I'll introduce them briefly right now, and then I'll have more details on each one of them before they give a presentation. So we have Dr. Jana McCord, who's the lead and principal researcher of Climate Change and Social Protection Research Initiative, and she is a poverty and inequality practice research specialist at ODI. We have Dr. Daniele Malerba, who's a senior researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. We have Jana Bischler, a technical officer in social protection on climate change at ILO, and Dunja Krause, who's lead environmental and climate justice program at UNRISD. Next slide, please. Right. So I already introduced myself. I'm head of social protection and health at the Red Cross Climate Center. I do a lot of work on with Anna, actually, and many other people in the room today. But I work a lot on the integration of climate science across timescales into social protection systems, including climate responsive social protection, shock responsive social protection. Our first speaker is Dr. Jana McCord, who has a long list of accolades. She's one of the most well-known names in this space. She is an independent researcher based in the UK with 30 years of experience in the NGO sector, government and academia. She's a specialist in social protection and works with DFAT and other bilateral donors, as well as the European Commission, the Bank, ILO, UN agencies, and a range of low and middle income governments and civil society organizations across Asia and Africa. Anna runs a small company, the Poverty and Equality Practice, and is a senior research associate at ODI. She's currently leading the Climate Change and Social Protection Research Initiative, which has been established jointly with herself and Cecilia Costella, and is working with DFAT, FCDO, KFW, European Union, the list goes on. Anna has degrees in sociology in Cambridge, sociology from Cambridge University, and economics at the Open University, and a master's and PhD in economics from the University of Cape Town. She is studying part-time for a degree in environmental studies at the Open University. Without further ado, I hand over to you, Anna, to take us through the report. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Megan. Thank you also to socialprotection.org for organising this session. I'm very grateful to them for putting it on, and thank you for my colleagues who've agreed to come and be discussants of this paper. And finally, I'd just like to thank KFW, who commissioned and financed this study. Next slide, please. This study is based on a report which was completed last year with my colleague Cecilia Costella. Next slide, please. And the study was carried out using, it was primarily a literature review, but we also carried out interviews with key informants working in the climate change and CCM sector. And so essentially this is a synthesis of current literature in the area. And I'm delighted that Daniele Malerba is here as one of our discussants, because he is one of the main contributors to this body of knowledge. Okay, so let me share with you the findings of the report, but start with the objectives. The aim was to illustrate how social protection can mitigate the negative poverty impact of decarbonisation policies on poor households and contribute to successful implementation of just transition policies. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is present five components of this report. The first briefly introduces climate change mitigation, CCM policies, explains what they are. Next, we'll go on and look at the way that these different policies impact on poverty and inequality. Then we'll look at the social protection response options and go on to look at some of the challenges in adopting some of these policy response options. And then finally, we'll look at ways forward. Next slide, please. Okay, the context for this work is the fact that this transition to climate resilient future in line with the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degree target is going to require really rapid implementation of greenhouse gas mitigation policies. And the question is, what is the role of social protection in response in relation to achieving these targets? How can social protection contribute to successfully achieving this goal? Next slide, please. Well, before we go on to look at how social protection can respond, let's actually look at what we're talking about when we talk about climate change mitigation policies. And this study focused on two main areas. One is carbon pricing instruments, and the other is the issue of green structural change. And both policies are really central to achieving the 1.5 degree target. So next slide, please. Let's look at each of these in turn. First of all, carbon pricing instruments. There's two main kinds of carbon pricing instruments. The first is direct instruments, which impose a charge on carbon dioxide emissions made during the production of goods and services. And the way that the instruments that are used for direct carbon pricing are things like the carbon tax, emissions trading systems, carbon credit mechanisms. So this actually is a way that states can impose a fee on CO2 emissions. The other approach is indirect, and that's a charge on specific fuels. And here the main policy instruments that we'll be talking about are fuel taxation and energy subsidy reform. So when we talk about carbon pricing instruments, these are actually the instruments that we're talking about. Next slide, please. The second set of instruments relates to green structural change. And what we mean by this is the transition from high to low carbon economies by the reallocation of resources to less polluting economic activities. So essentially shifting from carbon-based to renewable energy-based production and also organic agriculture. But primarily at the moment, we're talking about the shift to renewable energy-based production. And this entails the closure of traditional brown economy industries in energy intensive sectors such as coal mining and developing a green economy. So that's what we mean when we talk about green structural change. Thank you. Next slide. So let's look first of all at what the literature says about the impacts of carbon pricing. Essentially, carbon pricing results in an increase in the price of fuel. So whether it's direct or indirect, the impact is an increase in the price of fuel and also goods and services whose production uses fuel or entails greenhouse gas emissions. And if you're introducing carbon pricing, i.e. increasing the price of fuel consumption and CO2 emissions, the way that this impacts on the poor is, interestingly, primarily through the cost of public transportation and food, not directly through fuel consumption. And what the literature indicates is that the poverty impacts and the distributional impacts of carbon pricing are very context specific. And in particular, they're mediated by the size of the price shock, i.e. what are the carbon pricing, how is carbon pricing set? What is the level of carbon pricing? It also depends on which goods and services are affected and the proportion of household expenditure which goes on the most affected commodities. And the literature also indicates that population groups are very differently affected depending on their consumption patterns. So carbon pricing has very different impact on the rich, the poor, depends if you're urban or rural populations. And essentially it depends on the consumption patterns of particular households. And we see that impacts vary considerably between countries depending on the structure of their economy and the socioeconomic characteristics of the population. So next slide, please. What we see is that carbon pricing isn't inherently regressive or progressive in low and middle income countries, but the key factor is that in all instances, it increases the cost of the consumption basket of goods for the poor, and so results in increases in poverty. And I think this was a key finding for us because we had assumed that there may be an overriding impact and that such policies might in fact be regressive, but in fact it's highly context specific. The key factor is not the regressivity or progressivity, but the fact that it increases the cost of the consumption basket and so will have an impact on the poorest. Next slide, please. Then if we look at the impact of the green structural transition, what we see is effectively that the green structural transition is going to have a major impact on employment patterns. It's going to lead to job elimination, job transformation, job substitution, and in some measure, job creation. Next slide, please. Now, what this means in terms of impacts on poverty and on the poor is, again, going to be highly context specific, but we can draw out some general insights. And again, this is drawing on work taken forward by Daniele. What we see is that often job losses due to the transition will precede job gains. We see that the new jobs being created are likely to be created in different places, so geographically separated from where the old ones were lost. And we also see that the skills required by new jobs emerging as a result of this green transition will be different from those which are held currently by the current workforce. And the other factor which is clear is that there are going to be direct job losses from the closure of polluting industries, but also that there are likely to be indirect job losses, particularly among communities who are supporting and workers, perhaps in the informal sector, who are supporting and providing services for those working in the formal sector. So there will be losses in the formal and informal sectors, and direct and indirect job losses. So we see there's going to be this kind of temporal, spatial skills misalignments which are going to occur during this transition. And the overall impact is likely to be reductions in household income for those affected as they lose their employment. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at the poverty impact of this green structural transition, there's currently in the literature some uncertainty about the scale of brown job losses and the scale of green job creation. We also see that there's likely to be job losses in very specific geographical areas where brown industries are concentrated. In some countries, industrial activity is very heavily concentrated in certain locations, certain provinces, and that's where the impacts are likely to be greatest. Equally, we'll be seeing the impact in particular segments of the labour force, so that the impact won't be spread equally across the labour force. There's going to be considerable loss of low-skilled jobs, and these are the workers who will be less able to reskill or find work elsewhere due to human, financial, and social capital constraints. And so the concern is particularly for those working in low-skilled employment in brown sectors. And so what we're going to see is increase in poverty for certain population segments as a result of the green transition. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to summarize for you the kind of impact that we're going to be seeing. Direct carbon pricing, which is carbon taxes, emissions trading system, carbon crediting mechanisms, these are going to increase the cost of goods whose production entails greenhouse gas emissions. Indirect carbon pricing through energy subsidy reforms or energy taxes is going to increase the cost of specific targeted fuels and goods and services which use those fuels. And so these two sets of interventions are going to increase the price of the household consumption basket and increase the number of poor and the depth of poverty. If we look at the green structural transition, the impact is going to be reduced employment, which is going to mean reduced household income. So what we see is that there's a price effect and there's an income effect, and it's quite useful to look at policy responses to these separately. Next slide, please. So the challenge for us as working in the social protection sector is to look at how we can address these price effects and the income effects. And this is necessary both in order to address poverty, but also for another reason, which emerged quite clearly in the literature, which is that if these price and income effects aren't addressed, what we can see is that when similar policies have been introduced in the past, there's been an increase in social and political instability, and in many instances, difficulty in actually pushing through and implementing these policies. So the ability for states to remain stable and to implement these kind of CCM policies is contingent on ensuring that these price effects and income effects are addressed. So it's not only necessary in order to address poverty, but addressing this is necessary for the successful implementation of CCM policies and progress towards achieving the 1.5 degree target. Next slide, please. So now I'd just like to briefly talk through some of the response options. These are considered and discussed in more detail in the report, but I'll just give some of the highlights for the kind of policy options, and then we can come back and discuss them in more detail during the Q&A session. One way of addressing the price effect is to extend cash transfer provision, either through taking your existing system or putting in place cash transfer systems and extending the generosity, extending coverage, changing eligibility criteria so more people are in receipt of cash transfers. Alternatively, you can have lump sum transfers, one-off universal rebates. That's another approach that's been used in order to transfer resources to compensate. Another approach is to look at targeted subsidies or reduced taxation, finding other ways to increase purchasing power within households. And one reduced taxation option is to look at reducing VAT, which, as we know, is highly regressive, and that's a relatively easy way of reducing the cost of the consumption basket. Another approach is to introduce complementary subsidies and service provision, which will also reduce household expenditure and household costs. And here I'm talking about subsidized health provision, education provision, and even extending and subsidizing public transport, because public transport is one of the main ways that the cost will be transferred to the poor. Another approach is to look at energy price modification to avoid energy poverty among the poorest. And here you could have differential pricing with a tariff which offers free or reduced cost energy provision for consumption below a certain minimum threshold. You could look at subsidizing clean alternatives such as liquid petroleum gas, or you could look at phasing your interventions so that you start with fuels which are more used by the more affluent, such as, for example, aviation fuel, and only later move on to fuels which are consumed by the poor. Next slide, please. So then if we're looking at addressing the employment effects, there's two ways that we can address this through social protection. One is through income replacement, and the other is through promoting employment through active labour market policies. In terms of income replacement, we can look at the function of existing social insurance instruments, such as contributory pensions, unemployment insurance. And here, options to use existing mechanisms might be changing the eligibility criteria. So, for example, enabling people to take up their pensions at a younger age, reducing the qualifying period to be eligible for pension payments. Another approach is to simply introduce cash transfers, i.e. non-contributory pensions and unemployment payments. This would be a way of supporting those who are working outside the formal sector. And then I think that there's another whole area of interventions around active labour market policies, and these are set out in detail in the ILO guidelines for the just transition published in 2015. And here we're looking at issues such as skills training, vocational education training, job matching services, providing job subsidies, labour intensification, and also regulating the emerging employment. Because as I mentioned, unemployment is likely to be concentrated among those with low skills. And there's a risk that in the churning which will occur during this structural transition, that the poor will and low-skilled will suffer in terms of employment conditions. So ensuring that market regulation is adequate could help to make sure that wages and terms and conditions are adequate. Finally, there's an issue of direct job creation through public employment programs, which is another option for directly creating employment outside the market. So there's a mixture of market-based and non-market-based incentives which can be put in place. And I think here the key issue is that these kind of active labour market policies can be successful, but only if there's matching investment in green sector development. So that's the key corollary to these social protection instruments being effective. Next slide, please. There are, however, some significant challenges in terms of using social protection as a response to these adverse CCM impacts. I mean, the first is that existing provision in low and low middle income countries of social protection is quite limited. Globally, only 50% of the population actually has access to any form of social protection. And in Africa, that rises to more than 80% of people don't have any access to social protection. So it's critical that we're realistic in terms of appraising what already exists in country and what is and isn't possible. So coverage is low. There are high exclusion errors. Many programs struggle to include the poorest and particularly informal workers in their provision. And often the value of transfers under social protection is quite low, which may limit their ability to compensate for these kind of CCM impacts. And I think the other issue is that there are major constraints to expanding social protection provision, which we need to consider when we're thinking about how we can respond to this challenge. And the first is systems constraints in terms of systems related to identification, registries, delivery mechanisms. And I think these were very clearly highlighted where if we look back at the literature, at the experiences during COVID-19, we saw that where systems were undeveloped, there were significant challenges in terms of extending provision. There are also fiscal constraints. And what's clear from the literature is that while there's an aspiration that removing energy subsidies and income from carbon pricing might be a useful tool for financing extended social protection provision, it's not clear in all instances that this will actually be adequate. And again, it depends on the energy consumption profiles of particular countries. So fiscal considerations, fiscal constraints are a real issue that we have to consider. And the other, I think, is that in some instances, there are real political economy and ideological constraints to extended provision. Not all states recognize that extended social protection provision, particularly for the working age poor, is desirable. So there are a number of issues that we have to be mindful of when we're looking at how social protection can respond. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to share a few recommendations and then I'll pass over to my colleagues. In terms of country level recommendations, I think adequate policy analysis is absolutely essential. It's necessary to look at climate change mitigation policy options and analyze their impact, analyze the distributional impacts of different carbon pricing and green structural measures prior to their implementation. It's critical to look at their poverty and labour market impacts. So we need to look at the likely price and income impacts of any different CCM policies which are likely to be introduced. We need to look at which segments of the population will be affected, where, how will they be affected. And again, we need to carry out a fiscal analysis. What would be the cost of compensatory measures and what are the financing options? How does the cost relate to potential income from subsidy reform, for example? Can it be afforded domestically or is there a need for external financing and how might that be sought? And then it's also necessary to look at the capacity of the existing social protection sector. How able is the sector? What capacity does it have to actually respond through its existing programs? Does it have the capacity to introduce new programs which could address these challenges? Next slide, please. Then if we're looking at country policy development, the critical issue is to ensure that climate mitigation policy design and implementation is pro-poor. And what the literature indicates here is that CCM policy should only be introduced after compensatory mechanisms have been put in place for the reasons that I mentioned earlier in terms of acceptability, stability, limiting the adverse impact of these policies. So there's a clear sequencing issue. You need to make sure that your social protection measures, your compensation measures are in place first. In terms of being pro-poor, it's also important to prioritize the least regressive aspects of your programming. For example, initially, so for example, focus on those interventions which are going to have the least impact on adverse price impacts for the poorest. Perhaps focus initially on those kind of interventions which will more affect the richer segments of society. So sequencing is key here. And what seems important is to include social protection as a component of your national CCM policy discussion and align and integrate social protection policy with your national mitigation policy. And this includes taking social protection into consideration when you're doing your carbon pricing design, but also in green structural change planning. And here it's necessary not only to have a discussion with the climate and environment actors, but to include social protection, education, labour, and industrial and economic policy sectors. Because only in that way can we really ensure coherence and appropriate structuring and complementarity of policy interventions. Next slide, please. In terms of country-level development partner investment, I mean, it seems clear that if we want to use social protection to address these challenges, we need to continue investing in strengthening and building operational systems, which are necessary for effective operation and expansion of social protection provision. And similarly, we need to look at investment in employment and training. We need to look at investment in market-based employment and skills development initiatives. That will be critical for enabling the green transition aspect of CCM. Next slide, please. And finally, I think the other issue which emerges from the literature is this need to promote a dialogue between national governments and development partners on these issues, to promote an understanding of the impact of climate change mitigation policies on poverty, and to promote an awareness and understanding of the role of social protection in supporting the equitable implementation of CCM and increasing policy acceptability and political stability during this green transition. Next slide, please. Thank you. I mean, I think I've shared with you the key elements of the report. As I said, there's a lot more detail in the report itself, which I'll put a link to it in the chat, and I think it was included in the invitation. But now I very much look forward to handing over to my discussants, 3 experts in these areas who I'm sure will have very, very interesting commentaries and additional ideas to contribute to this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was so clear and so comprehensive. It was really easy to follow. Participants, please do keep the questions coming in the Q&A. And if you see questions that are written there that you really want a burning answer to, please do vote them up so we can, you can help me prioritize. Next, we'll begin with the first of our 3 discussants. Our first is Dr. Daniele Malerba. He's a senior researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. He's working on the program Transformation of Economic and Social Systems. His research focuses on the links between poverty reduction policies and climate change mitigation, with an emphasis on the role of social protection. In his research and publications, he employs different quantitative methods and a combination of data sets. Daniele holds a PhD from the University of Manchester and regularly collaborates with various international organizations. He teaches at a wide variety of universities. Over to you, Daniele, for your discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Megan, and good afternoon to everybody. I think it's a very nice topic, and I really enjoyed reading Anna's extensive review. So I think my role here is to basically complement what Anna presented and wrote about with maybe additional points and maybe some a bit more detailed points that also came out in the report. And I will focus mainly on the role of social protection in climate policies with 5 main points that I wrote down. But before doing that, one thing I want to make clear, just because I think it's critical, is that it's very important to ask social protection to make climate policies just and progressive rather than regressive. But really, it's very important to make climate policies themselves at first kind of just and socially progressive. This can be done in many ways. For example, as Anna mentioned, looking at pricing carbon in specific sectors. So, for example, in lower middle income countries, if you tax sectors like private transportation, of course, that's more progressive rather than taxing food. We did a recent paper, for example, exploring the possibility of a luxury tax, meaning taxing more goods that are consumed by richest households. And again, there we find striking difference in terms of the distributional incidence of carbon pricing. But also when you look at green transformation and, for example, I don't know, subsidies for solar panels, also those policies which are not considered here, many of them are actually regressive. So my point is that it's great to focus on social protection, but also we need to make climate policies themselves as much as possible progressive rather than regressive. So if I go now on the role of social protection, I have 5 main points. Some of them have been already touched by Anna in her presentation in the report, but I maybe have some complementary messages that I thought were important to give. So the first 3 points are mainly on policy design. And the first one is, I think probably the most important one is using, for example, social protection and cash transfers when we use carbon pricing. And there is a lot of growing literature in there, as Anna pointed out, one main thing is about exclusion errors and the targeting of social protection, especially in some low-income countries. And I just want to give the example of a paper we did looking at almost 200 countries. And what we find is that if we do a carbon pricing and social assistance, so cash transfer programs, we find that poverty basically decreases in all countries, apart from 10, 11 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason because of that is, of course, because most of the poorest population is excluded by social assistance programs. And therefore, these fiscal reforms that entail carbon tax and cash transfer are not able to really reduce poverty or inequality in those countries because social protection systems are not adequate. So this is really a big point because it's not just about decreasing less poverty, but it's really poverty increases even if you recycle the revenue. And this is also important in terms of efficiency because studies have shown that if you have a relative well-targeted social protection system, you can use just around 30% of the revenues from a carbon tax to compensate the poorest. This has been found, for example, in Latin America. But of course, if you do not have well-targeted and well-designed social protection programs, that 30% really goes up and you really struggle to make carbon pricing progressive. And that's why many countries still use subsidies rather than tax and redistribution system, because with subsidies, it's easier for them to reach the poorest. And we have seen this in the current energy crisis. So this was one point of underlining how really important is targeting in terms of carbon pricing and social assistance schemes. The second point is on design is about labor policy, which also Anna touched in terms of green transformation. And I think a lot of times in papers in research there is an oversimplification of the use of labor active and passive, also labor market policies with climate policies. And the reason is, as we all know, there is a lot of informality, job search and job matching is not very well developed in many countries. And this is further exacerbated in these CCM and green transformation policies, just because in many cases, for example, if you consider coal regions or coal districts, we're not talking about a few people moving from one sector to the other, but we're talking about whole communities having to completely change their economic systems. And this means either a lot of migration to new places or community-wide social protection schemes that are needed. So it's very different from just considering a few people in a community, but here is really a totally different active labor market policies which are needed, and they're not as simple as I think many times they are depicted in the literature. And one potential solution, especially in terms of migration, for example, is to link social assistance to labor market policies, because for many, especially the poor, being part of labor market policies, so spending time searching, is quite costly. So there is some evidence showing that if you link social assistance with active labor market policies, more of the poor also engage in terms of active labor market policies. My third point on policy design is about policy sequencing, which I think is really crucial. So first of all, as Anna said, it's really important to have social protection system in place before the policy, and especially social registries have been found critical, for example, in subsidy reforms in Indonesia, where it was very easy for the government afterwards to kind of identify who can get or should get the transfer. And the second point is that in many countries with subsidy reforms, it has been shown that transferring the money first, or at least having what is called unrelated transfer. So a sign in your bank account that you will receive a transfer kind of improves the acceptability of people to the policy because they trust that they will receive the money afterwards. So this is an important thing, but also in terms of sequencing, it's also important to, for example, start with a low carbon price and increase over time. So people are less kind of worried at the beginning, and once after time they understand how the carbon pricing works, how they get their revenue back, then they build much more confident in the policy, and then you can start increasing the price over time. But this can, of course, just be done if you have very good information campaigns. And this is maybe something that was not a significant part in the report, but I think is still very crucial. Actually, one of the most crucial things that have been found in subsidy reforms cases is about information campaigns, because really constant and long-term communication have been found to make people much more acceptant of subsidy reforms and also carbon pricing. So policy sequencing linked with information campaign is a very important tool as well. So my last 2 points are more on the political economy and of trust. And so I'll start with the trust one. So we have a lot of studies showing that, and this of course is linked with social protection, that climate policies to be accepted need to be just. So when you ask people what is the main determinant of your acceptance of climate policies, people say we want climate policies to be just. But then when you look at in practice, and if you ask people, do you want the government then to implement such policy, the actual main determinant is trust in the government. And so trusting in the government is something that I think can be explored to also be addressed via social protection. And there is some evidence on how social protection can increase social cohesion and trust in the government. But I think this is very much underexplored in terms of the role of social protection and climate policies. And I think this is a very important avenue of research because, as I said, recent studies show really that trust in the government is by far the main determinant of the acceptance of climate policies for citizens. So I think this is really a very important avenue of research. And then my final point is about the political economy. And I'm not talking here about vested interests like companies or fossil fuel kind of lobbyists, but I'm mainly talking about also mainly about citizens. And basically, what this report and my points made showed the potential of social protection for climate policies. But then if you look in practice, and if you look at, for example, the experience of high-income countries, you can see that just very few countries have used social protection in combination with carbon tax, for example. Just 2 countries, Canada and Switzerland, have used cash transfers in combination of ETS or carbon taxes. And the reasons are many. And if you ask people, they actually prefer to use the revenue of a carbon tax for green investments rather than social protection. And the reason, again, are many. So first of all, people do not understand how carbon tax works. So they think that if you do not invest the revenues for green investments, then the effect of a carbon tax actually does not change the environmental outcome of your country. And also the framing of the policy is very important. So many countries have established carbon taxes for fiscal or environmental reasons rather than social and economic reasons. And therefore, the revenue is usually allocated to these purposes. And if also when you look at Canada and Switzerland, the only 2 countries which has used social protection for climate change revenues for social protection, just a very small amount of the people knew that they were actually receiving the revenue from the carbon tax. So my whole point here is that in order to address political economy and push for social protection to be used in climate change, again, you really need to kind of communicate and frame climate policies also beyond fiscal and environmental reasons, but also to show and convince people that climate policies can also be good from a social and economic perspective. And this is especially important when we look at the difference between, as Anna mentioned, different type of climate policies. Because, for example, subsidy reforms are very different from carbon pricing in this sense, as subsidy reforms, especially if you consider, for example, MENA countries, are mainly part of social contracts between citizens and the government. And so this is much different from what carbon pricing are conceived. So also the way in which you use the revenue that you generate through climate policy is different on how you framed the policy or the original state. So it's very important to frame the policy in order to counterbalance the political economy. So these were just 5 of my reflections, and I'm happy to discuss a bit more later. I also just want to just reflect on the fact that from COP, we still in December, there is still a lot of interest in terms of social protection for climate, not just in energy transition partnership, but also in terms of climate clubs and how social protection can be used also with the European CBAM mechanism. So I think that in terms of finance, if we really find ways to convince and ensure how social protection can be used in climate policy, I think we are in a good spot to kind of really make this link much stronger also from a policy side. But I think I'll leave it here for now.
Thank you so much, Daniele. That was fantastic. I mean, it's always such a pleasure when people bring up points that you weren't previously thinking of. And I think so much of what you mentioned is not what you naturally go to, which is, you know, concerns about trust in government, information communication. You know, it's all these are all really, really critical issues, aren't they? And I learned something new about my own home country of Canada, which I always appreciate. We're going to move to our next discussant. Thank you everyone for putting in lots of questions. I really appreciate it. Please do keep putting them in and voting them up. Our second discussant, second of 3, is Jana Bischler, who is a technical officer on social protection and climate change at ILO, the International Labour Organization, agency of the UN. Try not to just endlessly use the acronyms for those that are joining us outside of our normal world. Working world. So Jana works at ILO, Social Protection Department in Geneva. She focuses on social protection and climate change. Position, she conducts research on the role of social protection in facilitating a just transition and addressing the impacts of climate change and supports countries in the implementation of the ILO Just Transition Guidelines. On behalf of the ILO, she also co-chairs the USP 2030 Working Group on Social Protection and Climate Change. And prior to joining ILO, she worked as a senior consultant in the social protection practice of Oxford Policy Management. She holds a Master's of Science in Development Economics from the University of Oxford. Over to you, Jana, for your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Megan, and also big thank you to Anna and Cecilia for the report, but also Anna for the presentation, and Daniele, I also particularly enjoyed your reflections just now. And I would like to also start a little bit by continuing Daniele's reflection on COP28, which lies just about a month behind us. And of course, as many of you know, countries agreed at COP28 to transition away from fossil fuels. So this discussion is really very, very timely. And it's an opportune moment, I think, to really reflect about how social protection can contribute to that, particularly because at COP28, there was also actually a discussion around the scope of the Just Transition Work Program that was established only 2 years ago. And the final text adopted on just transition also includes a very strong reference to social protection and its role in a just transition. So I think it's really, really great to now have this opportunity to discuss a little bit more in practice what that might mean. And Anna and Daniele already have done a great job in doing that. So I just want to use my time also to deliver a few complementary and additional reflections, maybe also by putting the discussion in the context of a just transition policy framework. So Anna mentioned the ILO Just Transition Guidelines that were formulated and approved in 2015 by representatives of all 187 countries that are members of the ILO, including also employer and workers organizations. And those guidelines really provide us with a blueprint for how we can transition to environmentally sustainable economies, while at the same time continuing to pursue the goals of eradicating poverty, promoting decent work, and social justice. And the key message here really, I think that has also already come out in some of the previous discussions, is that social protection really needs to be seen as part of a wider policy framework, which also means that social protection is absolutely essential, but not sufficient by itself to achieve a just transition, right? And Daniele also made this point that social protection policies will really be more effective if they're coordinated with different employment policies, such as active labor market policies or skills development. And then, of course, together, these can underpin the industrial and the sectorial policies that are needed to really push forward this green structural transformation that Anna also mentioned. And then, of course, in the case of carbon pricing, that also means coordinating a coordinated approach between macroeconomic and fiscal policies and social protection. So this really, I think, also reinforces the recommendation that in order to deliver this integrated policy framework, we need better coordination and also the participation of social protection actors and policymakers in this climate change mitigation and just transition planning. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to highlight here at this point that one solution for promoting more integrated policy making is also through the Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection for Just Transitions, which has already actually started its work in several countries now. So I think this element really here is also at the heart of what the Global Accelerator can achieve. The next point that I wanted to make is maybe just to complement this picture around the just transition a little bit further. I mean, we've spoken quite a bit around the energy transition, and this is what many people often think about when they think of a just transition. And of course, this is absolutely a central and very, very important part of it. That's no question. But the additional point I wanted to make here is that really when we think about a move to environmentally sustainable economies, we need to really think about how this will affect all different sectors of the economy. And especially that's also important if we think about different country contexts. So for example, in many developing countries, a large share of emissions is actually driven also by the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors. And at the same time, the ILO also estimates that over 1.2 billion jobs depend on a stable environment and on the possibility for people to sustainably use natural resources. So what I think this makes clear is that the agriculture, fisheries, and forestry sectors really also play a super important role here when we think about a just transition. And this, of course, also has implications for social protection and, what that might mean in terms of how social protection can support a just transition. So just to give you a couple of examples, of course, we've spoken a lot about how social protection can support people in the phase out of polluting industries. The most experience, I think, so far is around coal mining. But there are also quite a few emerging examples now how social protection can support people that are affected by the restriction of the use of natural resources, such as, for example, logging bans or fishing bans to help conserve those resources. So just to give an example, in Brazil, there's an innovative unemployment insurance scheme for artisan fishers who are affected by seasonal fishing bans. And the ILO is currently also exploring similar options in Peru and Ecuador for such an approach. And then maybe just to reiterate again this importance of really combining social protection with different trainings or employment policies, active labor market policies. This is really so that we can also move in this just transition framework beyond the just, this compensation and protection angle, but really move it more towards the promotion angle, right? Where we, for example, can see that by linking cash benefits with trainings in agroforestry or other climate smart agricultural initiatives, we can help people move into more sustainable and climate resilient practices. And there's quite a few innovative examples there, also from Paraguay, Brazil, or Malawi already that have done that. And then maybe taking this even one step further, if we also think about a just transition and what that might mean in terms of what we want to transition into, right? Into what kind of economies and models we want to have when we are transitioning, then that also really means about thinking how social protection can make sure that the jobs that are being created through the transition are also decent jobs that have access to social protection. And maybe just to sort of come back to the decision at COP regarding a just transition, that also really reinforces this point that new jobs should be decent jobs and should have access to social protection. And that really, I think, brings me to the point of the importance of universal social protection, right? So, I mean, of course, there are lots of different approaches we can take, but really, I think what, if there's anything that the COVID-19 pandemic has also taught us is that countries and people that have greater access to universal, adequate and comprehensive social protection are in a much better position to navigate those impacts of transitions, but also crises. And of course, that's absolutely relevant to the case of the green transition and to climate change. So the other point here just to make around, the link of universal social protection and a just transition is also that is really important to make sure that the transition and climate change don't further increase existing inequalities. And I think the gender dimension is a really good example in this case. So there's quite a few studies also that show that while all industries are affected by the green transition in Latin America, for example, estimates show that male-dominated sectors will gain more jobs than sectors that are traditionally dominated by female workers. So again, I mean, I think this really illustrates that point that if we want to make sure that these gender inequalities are not widened further, we need to really, keep working towards things like universal maternity protection, but also universal, health protection or disability protection to make sure that increases in the unpaid care burden don't, further take us away from this goal that actually should be a just transition. And then the very last reflection that I wanted to make also relates to this link between carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidy reform, and maybe the opportunity that also might create for social protection. So, I mean, I think Anna and Daniele have done a really great and comprehensive job at illustrating how social protection can be used to offset some of those price shocks or negative consequences, and to really sort of illustrate how complicated that can also be in certain contexts. But the last sort of bit that I just wanted to leave you with maybe is that carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidy reform can also be really an opportunity for us to work towards establishing social protection floors and work towards closing those financing gaps that we have in achieving a universal social protection. So in 2022, the IMF estimated that countries spend over $7 trillion worldwide on direct and indirect fossil fuel subsidies. And at the same time, just to contrast that to the ILO estimations for the financing gaps in closing social protection, which amounted to $1.2 trillion in 2022. So basically, if we do a very crude comparison, we can see that we could close the financing gaps to providing universal social protection at about 20% of what countries spend worldwide in 2022 on direct and indirect fossil fuel subsidies. And I mean, of course, this is just a sort of a thought experiment, because we know that there's not a perfect match in terms of the, the financing gaps of social protection and the countries that spend the most money on fossil fuel subsidies. But I think the point that I just wanted to make is that when we think about reforming carbon prices, we should really think about the link to closing these financing gaps of social protection. And I know that there are some countries that have actually started making that link. So, for example, when Morocco reduced the fossil fuel, their fossil fuel subsidies, they expanded social health protection by about 2 million people, right? So I think this just illustrates how you can use some of that money to incrementally try to close those coverage gaps that you have, which ultimately will put countries in a much better situation also to address and sort of confront the impacts that climate change will have. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion and the rest of the reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jana. That was also a very clear and concise set of points. I particularly like that you helped us keep a very wide lens, so get away from the habit of thinking so much about the energy sector and just thinking about some of these strands, the unintended effects on majority women businesses and so forth, and of course all the links that are just to the general universal social protection, universal basic income. I could go on. I'll go to our last discussant, Dunja, to give ourselves lots of time for the questions that are coming in. Dunja's lead on environmental and climate justice program at UNRISD, UN Research Institute for Social Development. She leads the environmental and climate justice program that focuses on just transition to low carbon development and transformative adaptation and resilience. Dunja co-edited the volume Just Transitions, Social Justice in the Shift Towards a Low Carbon World, and co-coordinates the Just Transition Research Collaborative. She's a geographer by training. She's previously worked at the UN Institute for Environment and Human Security, focusing on vulnerability assessments to natural hazards, the development of global risk index, and the evaluation of climate adaptation options. Over to you for your closing reflections.
Thank you so much, Megan. And I can see for all of us, it's different to actually stick to our allotted times, because this is a topic that's not only timely, but we're all very passionate about it. I'll have to meet that same challenge. But I really thank you for the invite. I think this is a really timely discussion, but also the paper is really pertinent and relevant at this moment, because we just cannot stress enough how important social protection is for advancing the so urgently needed transition to low carbon development. We know that ignoring justice and welfare will hinder climate action and also leads to social unrest and protests, which we've seen in many countries around the world. If you think of the Yellow Vest movement in France, but of course also the protests that Jana was already mentioning to fuel subsidy reforms in many countries, including Nigeria, etc. So I will try and focus my discussant input on things that I either see a bit differently or areas I feel would have merited more elaboration, as that seemed more interesting than just listing all the things that I love about this paper and that I agree with, which there are plenty of. But do keep in mind that this doesn't make the paper any less useful or interesting or important. My first point, I have 4 points. I'll try to move through them relatively quickly. My first one is that I felt that whereas you go really into great detail, and it's really important to highlight all these possible negative impacts of mitigation policies and elaborate the social protection measures that are there to buffer these, I feel like the paper is surprisingly silent when it comes to just transition, actually. You mentioned it's all about how do we have, mobilize social protection for just transition, but I feel like it doesn't really do justice to the many kind of different interpretations, approaches to just transition that are out there and the ways that it's currently being approached and implemented. And I think this will be very worthwhile, because it can show really what principles just transition needs to be based on in order to be beneficial to welfare and in order to match kind of the ideas that are behind social welfare systems. But also just to make sure that it doesn't get misinterpreted by people who are looking at just transition from a very narrow-minded focus. And I think, I mean, Jana already went into the ILO guidelines there. Of course, the ILO is an important agency really pushing for just transition that is based on social dialogue, that is based on strong social consensus, rights at work, gender equality, and adequate and sustainable social protection for job losses. But in many countries, I think we see different actors engaging in just transition and proposing really a vast area of approaches. Now, they can be from very narrow measures that really just try to compensate like people who lose their jobs in a sector directly, to more kind of reform type approaches that are trying to expand distributive procedural justice in the labor market more generally, to really very transformative approaches that are questioning political economy, that are trying to build kind of a local alternative economy built on like social and solidarity, for example, social and solidarity economy principles. So I feel like getting a little bit more into the just transition debates and kind of introducing this could also help to really emphasize the point that there's no general trade-off between poverty reduction and decarbonization. Of course, there are uneven transitional impacts and that need to be considered and alleviated. But I think a low carbon economy can in many ways be more conducive to reducing inequalities and to kind of proposing or bringing forward a shared prosperity than fossil fuel-based extractivist economies, because they can be more decentralized, they can be based on publicly owned renewable energy systems, etc., and they can really introduce changes that rectify current injustices in our system. So that brings me kind of to my second point, which I think an area that generally doesn't get a lot of attention in the debates, to my knowledge, is the questions of interlinkages between different welfare regimes and just transitions. Because I think there's no question that people agree social protection is very crucial, is a key element of just transition, but they don't necessarily look at, okay, what types of social protection may be more conducive to just transition than others? And if so, how do we promote them? I think this is kind of really underlining your recommendation also in the paper of assessing the capacity of existing social protection systems, because there's really little, I think, acknowledgement in the just transition debates that happen around kind of broader questions of social protection. I think, I mean, if you think just of the vast differences, that you have in depth and breadth. If we think, for example, of a very well-developed universal social protection system that already has provisions for unemployment, reskilling, etc., that's much better equipped than a country with a very fragmented social protection system with low levels of coverage and benefits. So this might be a no-brainer for all of you people who work a lot on social protection and know the ins and outs of different welfare regimes, but I don't think this is clear to climate folks, or at least it doesn't feature, in my perspective, in the majority of the just transition debates that don't seem to go beyond acknowledging social protection is relevant. So I think here, in addition, studying these interlinkages could really provide valuable insights on the possible synergies of advancing social protection for just transitions and vice versa. So kind of finding ways of explicitly approaching just transition as a larger social protection question compared to introducing compensatory measures at a firm level or local level only. So I think that's a really important area, and it could also maybe actually bring up a potential mismatch to some extent between the more publicly policy-oriented, I don't want to say top-down, but in a way top-down social protection debates that are maybe more focused on national level, which with the just transition discussion that is very workers-focused, rooted in the tripartism that Jana mentioned, and where participation and workers' voice are extremely important in the design and delivery of the policy itself. So I think there might be some tension when trying to bring those two bigger policy areas together. Now, thirdly, I think this goes to the point that Jana already touched upon on the question of what it is we're actually transitioning into. And here, I think, going beyond the question of, okay, how do we make sure that the new jobs are decent jobs, we can also even take it broader to kind of development system level and think about, okay, whose visions and values guide the transition process, do we use this transition actually as an opportunity to transform our political economy for greater equality, for energy democracy, if we want to stick to the energy sector? Do we revisit the social contract that we currently have and kind of work towards forging an eco-social contract, which is something UNRISD has been working on recently, something that's really more rights-based, universal, a contract with nature, tries to rectify historical injustices as well? Or do we merely try to replace one type of job with another without challenging underlying power structures? And I think here, I think opening this up, we can also really discuss in more depth a potential conundrum that I felt might arise when we look at the pro-poor approach that you're proposing, because I mean, I'm absolutely in favor of that, but I feel like that when tackling transition within this really highly concentrated fossil fuel industries, where it was already mentioned, no, it might be a community where almost all people, I mean, not all, but like really the vast majority of people are dependent on one specific sector that needs to be phased out. Those are maybe not currently the people who are poor, but those might be, like if I'm thinking of South Africa, you know, very high levels of unemployment in general, very high levels of informal employment, where coal employment might be, you know, currently the one area where you have somewhat like decent jobs, not great for your health, obviously, but good pay, stable to some extent, etc. So there's this tension also between like choosing how do we design these policies to make sure that they avoid poverty, because of course these people have also families, etc., community members that are dependent on their income. We don't want them to just go without any compensation, but they might not be the people who are currently showing up as poor in the statistics. And I think this brings me to kind of another like larger point on how like questions of just transition in terms of like really this active labor market policies, where I think it needs to even go beyond that and look at green industrial policy and the creation of alternative local economies that provide quality jobs, because otherwise we do come to this point where possibly, I think Daniele mentioned it, possibly entire communities will depend on social protection or have to move somewhere else. And I think this is really something that's not trivial and is extremely difficult in practice. I don't know if there are really good examples that have done this well. I keep thinking of the German Ruhr area, which is where, I mean, I grew up quite close to that, and where, I mean, the hard coal exit that wasn't a climate policy per se, that was just the result of economic decline, has really left an area relatively destitute for quite a long time, even though there were many big millions and billions of euros and invested from the German government, from the local government, from the EU, where a lot of measures were taken. But we had exactly the same issue that Anna already mentioned, relatively high share of low-skilled workers that lost their jobs, and it was really difficult to attract industries that kind of replace those jobs. No, there was also quite bad examples of incentive settings to companies that then have moved out again after a very short amount of time, and that provided very precarious jobs, not decent jobs at all, etc. And I mean, to this day, the unemployment in that region is almost twice the German average. So I think this is really something to keep in mind. And I think that's something where we need to spend a lot more of our time trying to figure this out, where we need to learn from local initiatives, I think, community-based projects that are really more bottom-up, that aim to forge alternatives based on the principles of social and solidarity economy, for example, that really put social and environmental objectives before profits. I think, yeah, just a lot more work is needed here. I think personally, I also feel it wouldn't hurt to mention all the negative impacts of extractive industries that go beyond the abstract global warming, but have very direct adverse health impacts and cause pollution that erodes livelihoods, etc. But just kind of, I know, sorry, we're out of time. I just to kind of close on my fourth and final point is also linked to finance, because I think that was, I mean, that's what most countries are now trying to grapple with. No, how do we actually do this? How do we fund this? And I think when reading the sections on carbon pricing, first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge, like, I found it so mind-boggling how many of the policies that you have studied introduced like fewer reforms without a social component. No, it's just for anyone kind of knowing how important social protection is, it's just not understandable how this has been done and why this hasn't been done better. So just to underline how important I find that point. But then I also kept wondering what kind of dependencies on continued emissions there are, or that we're maybe even newly creating in some cases, if social protection investments are now based on revenue either from oil, gas, and mining directly or from carbon pricing, because ultimately we want those industries to go away, right? And so I was just wondering, how will that work in the long term, but also how does that work, or does it work when dealing with state-owned enterprises? Like if we think of like electricity sector, where many countries have actually state-owned enterprises that run this, does that still work, or is that a problem? Do we just shift budgets within the government, or can we make this work? So how do we compensate for that and ensure that social protection is still going strong once we've achieved widespread emission reductions and industry phase out? And yeah, I think this just brings me back also to one of my earlier points, and stressing the importance, as Jana also did, of universal social protection systems, linking much stronger these debates on social protection with debates that are currently happening at the Just Transition Work Program under the UNFCCC, which I think is relatively blind to some of these social protection debates, in my opinion, beyond the acknowledgement of, yes, it's important. So I think I'll stop here. Sorry for taking more time than I wanted. Such a good topic.
I can just sense your passion for this, Dunja. I really appreciate it. It's so helpful also to have your mind on the tensions and to highlight those, because this is what we really need to grapple with. And I think you've raised a lot of fantastic points. I'm going to jump into questions. I'm going to prioritize the ones that haven't been answered in text. The first one I want to highlight is from Zach Issa. I think it's for you, Anna, but anyone could feel free to jump in. He says, I'm curious about your perspectives about how could the structure of delivery of public employment programs be modified to improve their effectiveness in achieving a just transition, especially thinking of workers in specific geographic areas who will be affected. Anna, do you have any thoughts on adjusting the structure and delivery of public employment programs? No small question at all.
Hi, yes. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Thank you for those excellent discussant inputs. They were fascinating. And I tried to share documentation which reflected issues being raised by the discussants in the chat box as they were talking. So please do look in there for things. Yes, I mean, I think what we're going to see is the market can respond to these challenges in as much as there is directed investment in areas affected. And we heard about the Ruhr still be affected. One of our comments was talking about areas in Japan, one of the commentators, where there's still many decades later depression due to the collapse of the industry there. So I think the issue is what kind of incentives can be adopted through industrial policy to actually encourage investment in those areas. So there's a whole market-based set of responses to these challenges. And the question is, how does social protection complement that? And I think public state employment is probably going to be increasingly necessary in this context, because there will be lags in investment, lags in the development of new employment opportunities. And if you look historically, every time there's been a major shift in the structure of economies, if we're looking at the Industrial Revolution in the last century, if we're looking at the Great Depression in the 1920s and 30s, public employment programs have been used to kind of cushion that transition, that profound shift in the nature of the global economy and the structure of national economies. So I think there will be a call for increased direct public sector employment. And probably the old kind of social protection models of public employment programs might no longer be adequate. And we might want to be looking more at investment in green infrastructure, in infrastructure and interventions which address ecosystems collapse, which address restoring biodiversity, which look at adaptation, mitigation measures. So I think there's probably, Zach, space for looking at large-scale public employment programs which address some of the broader challenges of climate change, because we're not just looking at the impact of CCM policies on labour markets. If we look at the impact of climate change itself, it's going to have a profound impact on agricultural livelihoods, on on economic developments which are in liminal areas, in coastal areas, and that there's going to be major labour market disruption at the same time as the disruption caused by these climate change mitigation policies. So I think there's a real need to look very carefully at how state-sponsored employment can play a role within this. And I shared a link to some JETP initiatives which are trying to look at how external and domestic investment can be combined to address some of these challenges. So yes, Zach, I think there is a need for increased public employment. I think it's been used in the past. And I think not only does it have a role in increasing incomes, a social protection function, it has a kind of macroeconomic stabilization function. And that's going to be critical because we're going to see really major disruptions in our economies. And I think if we want to avoid this kind of political destabilization, we need to be thinking about the macroeconomic stabilization function of social protection as well.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. If I haven't specifically called on you, but you have a burning comment, please do just give me any kind of body language and I will be watching. I'm going to move on to a question from Katrin Gassior. She's wondering about the role of active labor market policies. I know several speakers discussed active labor market policies. I think this will be a key one. Given the current situation of comparably small formal markets and larger informal markets in many low and middle income countries, have you come across any good examples in your work? So looking for examples, but also people can speak more generally to this topic of the need for active labor policies in specifically in these contexts with really large informal and small formal. Can I pass to you, Daniele, if you have thoughts?
I mean, yeah, this is, of course, a crucial point when we look at green transformation. I mean, the example I can give is that many studies, including one that we did, we found that indeed there is a positive effect in terms of job creation. So green transformation creates jobs, even though the effect is very small. We're talking about 20 million new jobs globally. The problem, and this is because, of course, there is a labor multiplier of green transformation. So jobs in the green economy are much more labor intensive than in fossil fuels. The problem is that the jobs created are in sectors that have very high in-work poverty rates, which means that we should not just look at the number of jobs created vis-a-vis the number of jobs destroyed, but the quality of those jobs. And this is something that usually is not taken too much into account because sometimes it's very difficult to define when a job is good or not. But we did find that many jobs created are in sectors and countries with very high in-work poverty rates. And the main reason for this is because of informality and low social protection coverage. So maybe this just gives much more evidence on the fact that social protection and formalization of jobs is crucial, especially in terms of wages and security for workers. So going beyond crude numbers, but looking more at type of jobs and the quality of jobs.
Thank you so much, Daniele. Anyone have any more burning comments on this topic? Otherwise, I'll move on to one that actually several questions have highlighted, which is looking at subsidy reform. So the question, I can see Anna's typing. That's a great feature. This one is from Paul Mando and Goma. So as indicated, energy subsidy reforms will provoke hikes in poverty rates through the price effects and income effects, through job losses generate generally, it's moving around as people write questions. Oops.
It moved to answered.
Oh, it moved to answered. Wonderful. Yes, because Anna was typing. Great. Okay. Job losses will generally translate to an erosion of the financing base for Social Security. At the same time, there's a growing need for Social Security benefits and services. Are there any specific examples on how governments addressed the increased financial strains on social protection systems to ensure sustainability? I want to open it up, just I think general reflections related to energy subsidy reforms and effects on stability in particular. I know many people have highlighted stability and energy prices. Of course, we've seen this. We've seen this, globally many times in the last few years. Can I call on you again, Anna? Actually, I know this is an area of interest of yours.
No, I just wanted to say, because some of the questions about ESR were linking it back with the World Bank. And the World Bank's energy sector reforms have been quite controversial over the decades. But what emerged is that they've actually done a great deal of really good empirical work looking at the impact of reforms, looking at how the adverse impacts might be addressed. Ruslan Yemtsov has done a great deal of work in this area, which I cite in the paper. And there's an initiative called SRAF, which is explicitly about how you start thinking of it. It offers guidelines in terms of how you start thinking about the policy questions, how you start analysing the context. And so I think actually there's the World Bank experience on implementing subsidy reforms for very different reasons, but does also have a lot to teach us. So I'd refer people to some of that. Affordability, I mean, I think the key question, Daniele said that in aggregate, 30% of subsidy of the income from getting rid of subsidies and from carbon pricing will be sufficient to make significant inroads on the poverty impacts. But I think this really varies from country to country, depending on the nature of energy use within those countries. So in some contexts, domestic financing will be available. In others, will be sufficient. In others, it clearly won't be. And then I think it's critical to really start linking this into the loss and damage agenda. And that's currently under negotiation. How is that framed? What is included? And what kind of policy measures should be financed through loss and damage? And I think this is a really interesting area and potentially very fruitful area to go forward. But I see Daniele also has some comments on this. So please, Daniele.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, you almost said what I was going to say, but I mean, there is always a study that I like to refer to, which estimates that in Latin America, it costs $2 to transfer $1 to the poorest 40% through cash transfers, while it costs $12 to transfer $1 through subsidies. So this is just to give how much actually you could have a much higher efficiency in terms of targeting through cash transfer rather than subsidies. So I see subsidy reforms as a positive thing in terms of fiscal space for social protection rather than a negative one. Of course, there is a lot of social contract or political economy issues, but in terms of fiscal space, I think it's a good solution.
Thank you very much. Both you, Danielle, and Jana have had some mic drop statistics on fuel subsidies that are really jarring and helpful to keep things in perspective. I thought I'd be cheeky and ask one of my own questions. We've been talking a lot about this is a significant mindset change in the way that we use social protection systems. And I wondered if perhaps Jana and then Dunja, could you speak a little bit about what you think, what kind of evidence we need to start being able to generate to kind of continue this mindset change on the use of social protection systems for this specific purpose? What do you think people need to hear for that change of heart and mind? And I mean that very broadly. It could be at policy level, but also the general public. Open to you to share your thoughts. Over to you first, Jana.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Megan, for the really good question. I think there's several dimensions to this, no? And I mean, I think we've already heard quite a few, and I really liked Daniele's statistic just now about how much it costs to transfer cash to poorer people, comparing that between cash transfers and fuel subsidies. And I think it's exactly things like this that we need more, because people often think or say that social protection is really expensive, and that especially for low-income countries, it's way too expensive to afford. And I think the more evidence we have that shows that it is actually possible to finance social protection, and then making that link with, you know, the amount of money that countries actually do spend on fossil fuel subsidies, I think is already quite an important one. And then maybe taking it a little bit into maybe more the sort of climate change, adaptation, resilience sphere, I also feel that where we're still missing a lot of research is really on showing how just sort of your routine life cycle social protection programs actually already really contribute to reducing the vulnerability of people to climate change and to sort of climate change impacts. I mean, we've done a lot of there's a lot of research now on you know, shock responsive social protection and things that need to be done in terms of supporting people in emergencies. But I think we need much more empirical research that also shows that, you know, just continuing to build your social protection floors, your life cycle programs actually already really helps reduce people's vulnerability to climate change. And I think that's an area that sometimes is a little bit overlooked, because we often think we need to do things that are very specific, you know, and we do need to do them, but we also need to get the basics right first, to have that sort of stable ground that we can then build on and do more things specifically to address different situations. So that's my 2 cents on that. Looking forward to hearing more from Dunja.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a difficult question because it's going to expose a little bit that I'm not actually a social protection expert. But UNRISD, of course, has a long history of working on social policy and social protection. And the bits that I do know is that we've also had, I mean, it's a bit dated now, but we've had quite a lot of seminal work, I think, really highlighting how social policy and social protection can have a developmental role. So basically trying to argue against this logic of, oh, first we need to develop to have the money to then offer like social protection. It was really a line of work led by a former director of ours, showing how if you have social policies in place early in your industrialization and development process, that can actually put you on a better trajectory and really contribute to your development, right? So I think that's one area that would merit kind of a renewed look and more work that kind of puts it a bit more into the contemporary era, because I think that work was from the early 2000s and didn't really look at climate too much, to be honest. I think also this point that I made earlier on these interlinkages of different welfare regimes, if you will, and just transition could merit more attention to really look at, okay, how much does it actually cost to do just transition in different circumstances? You know, in there we could, we don't have to focus only on low income countries. We can even look at higher income countries where the differences are also huge. If you look at the US versus Europe, for example, different European cases. I think those 2 areas to me are really interesting. And I think then the third issue is, again, potential tension that I see is that we might be opening quite a can of worms. Now, if we think of all of the communities of practice that are within social protection and that are within climate mitigation and just transition, I think there's a lot of groundwork that has to be done that goes much beyond research and evidence, but that really needs to bring people together in a kind of sort of open dialogue to try and get over some of the deadlocks of negotiation, no? Because I think some of it has to do also with synergies and identifying those, but they go into kind of areas that are really touchy and political. Like if we think about climate finance and the emphasis that that needs to be additional is really problematic, because then arguing that a social protection investment is actually a climate investment is kind of doesn't really work, no? Because you will immediately have countries saying, no, you can't claim this as climate finance, this needs to be additional, blah, blah, blah. So I think that's also an area where we need to try and move past some of the politics of the policy making process itself.
Thank you so much. And it is good to have someone from outside of the sector raise some of these tensions. I also find myself in that role, coming from a climate background, sometimes saying, wait, from my perspective, it feels a bit different. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be a part of this. I think the speakers have transitioned some of their passion for the subject to us. And thanks so much to the participants and the great questions. This will be recorded, of course, so please feel free to share the recording to friends and colleagues that haven't been able to make it today. And I will close now. Oh, great. Thank you for sharing the last slide. There's a QR code. Oh, that helps you become a member of socialprotection.org. Very handy. So I'll give a moment before we completely close for anyone who wants to capture that QR code. Please do keep joining us in this conversation. And thank you so much to the discussions, to other discussants, and to Anna and the co-collaborators for making the excellent paper that I just hear people talking about constantly. It's really had a dramatic effect and a big buzz throughout the sector, which is wonderful. I'll close now. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a lovely rest of the day.